Well, welcome everyone to the North Texas Church of Freethought's May 16th, 2021 service event. This will go up on YouTube later, and if you're watching it on YouTube later and you've not subscribed, please do subscribe so you get notices. Give us a thumbs up, make some comments below. I think it's really important to involve everyone who's interested in the kinds of values that we promote to participate in that way. So you might recognize the title here, Be Ready Always to Give an Answer, is a biblical kind of quotation, and some of today's, or the bulk of today's presentation is going to look at this subject of Christian apologetics. And I guess it's not just Christianity, though, it's all these whores for the supernatural. Everybody is promoting gods and all these things to which we are really very firmly opposed, and that probably is the one thing that really ruins everything, as Christopher Hitchens would say. It's not so much God, because obviously there are very liberal believers, even Christians, people like John Shelby Spong, the Episcopal bishop, who does not peddle the supernatural the way these others do. I'm going to show a short video of one of these Christian apologetics who's gotten quite famous on the lecture circuit, involved in doing debates and so forth. You will instantly recognize his name, for example, I think, which is William Lane Craig. So this is another biblical thing here, and keep in mind as you watch this video, just like the Christians say all scripture is profitable, gosh, isn't that a double entendre? Many of these preachers certainly do find all their scriptures and religion to be very profitable, although the quotation from this alleged letter from Paul to Timothy, which we pretty sure is a forgery, it's not considered to be actually written by Paul, was referring to profitable for doctrine and so forth and so on. But what we say in contrast is that all thought, all ideas are useful, including the wrong ones. And in fact, sometimes we learn more from things that are wrong because we come to understand why they're wrong, and that can help us not fall into error so many times, because that certainly is the greatest problem that we have. Not sin. The problem is not failing to follow a bunch of prescribed rituals, but of going wrong when it comes to our thoughts and ideas. But with that, let me stop the share, and then we'll start the share again with the video I want to show. And this is William Lane Craig. Let me, I apologize ahead of time if I have to adjust the volume. Let's see how it is. First of all, just reasonable faith, that's the William Lane Craig's organization. I think, gosh, think of what an oxymoron that is, kind of like jumbo shrimp or original copy, that sort of thing. Oxymoron comes from the Greek, by the way. Oxy means acute or sharp, and moron, of course, means moronic. Interestingly, the word oxymoron was not even used by the ancient Greeks. I don't think that's ever been found, but here he's saying reasonable faith. I mean, if you're going to have faith, the whole idea is, if it were reasonable, you wouldn't have to have faith. On the other hand, sometimes we are accused of having faith in reason, and I would say that our faith is not so much in reason, but our faith is in our ability to sort things out. And reason is one of those ways that we do that. Logical principles come from experience. They're not just things we assume, although we certainly do involve ourselves in mathematics, for example. People make assumptions and then follow out those the consequences of those assumptions. And that's why you can have different kinds of math. So this is pulled off of YouTube, Dr. Craig's advice on reasonable faith on the subject of Christian apologetics.
I would encourage every Christian to have a list of arguments memorized that he can share with an unbeliever. The typical unbeliever, in my experience, has no good reason for his unbelief. He's simply been taught to repeat the slogan, "There's no good evidence for God's existence." And this is really, I think, a mask for intellectual laziness on his part. But it's serves very effectively as a conversation stopper because the average Christian doesn't have any good evidence for God's existence. And so this, in effect, gives the atheist the trump card. There's no evidence for God's existence, and that's the end of the conversation. But if you will have a list of our...
So, interested in people's reaction to that, feel free to interject. It's pretty strange, I think, to say that there's no good reason for unbelief. You need a reason for belief, not for unbelief. And you know, he calls the request for evidence to be a slogan and intellectual laziness to not accept the kind of evidence he's going to present in a minute, or talk about in a minute, his typical, in fact, he's just really summarizing his whole shtick. You don't need to watch one of his hour-long, 2-hour-long debate encounters with people like Christopher Hitchens, Sean Carroll, and others, because it's the same shtick every time. And I think it's interesting. He says the average Christian doesn't have evidence. Well, whether he's average or not, he has not evidence either. And of course, it's not just evidence, but then you'll see he talks about argument really more than evidence, and the evidence he presents is really thin. It's pretty much all argument. Any comment on that from the rest of you?
Yeah, that's just the perfect argument to give to people who can't reason.
Yes. Notice how he says, you know, you need to memorize a list. He'll get to that in just a minute. So he's talking to Christians here. He's trying to tell them how to confront us, how to deal with us. I have to give him credit, though. At least he doesn't say, here's the problem with these atheists. He calls us unbelievers, which is a little bit more accurate. I think it really would be even more accurate to say non-Christians, because I think Muslims are believers, but maybe he's just calling unbelievers all those who are unbelievers in Christianity. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Some time ago, a very believer friend of mine gave me a book that her church had published. The first, the preface of the book would say, non-believers need a lot more faith than believers, so not to believe in God. And he's talking about having faith. The guy does not have any idea what he's talking about. I mean, atheist does right off the bat denies faith. They go by reason, and he has no idea what he's talking about. So this is similar to that. I mean, it's like we have to have atheist has a lot more faith not to believe than to believe.
Yeah, one of our church bulletins back maybe a couple of years or so ago is talks about that book. That I think actually the title of the book is something like "It Takes More Faith to Be an Atheist." Merlin brought that.
I don't remember, but it wasn't that. No, it wasn't. It was something. It was kind of an obscure writer. You know. Sometimes the churches says, "Hey, if you wrote a book about faith and everything, bring it to us. We'll print it." This was an obscure writer. It's an obscure title. I read first 10 pages. It's amazing how ignorant this guy is. So yeah. I don't think that was it, though.
Well, I think to the mainstream, a lot of these people are obscure, but in Christian apologist circles, they have their own reputations. I mean, they're stars in their little niches.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
So let's go on here. You'll enjoy the rest of this too, I think. And notice we're not editing or cutting out anything. Don't anybody say we're not letting them really have their say.
Arguments memorized at that point. What you can do is say to the unbeliever with a surprised look on your face, well, is that what you think? Why, I can think of at least 5 arguments for God's existence. And at that point, he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then you're off and running. So when people ask me, well, there's no evidence for God's existence, and I say, well, sure there is, and they say, well, like what? I typically just list about 5 arguments. I'll say, God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists, rather than nothing. God is the best explanation of the beginning of the universe. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning Jesus of Nazareth. And finally, God can be personally known and experienced. And I find that many times just giving a list of the arguments is enough to satisfy the unbeliever.
Well, I guess now you're all believers, aren't you? Because he gave the list and he said this is enough to satisfy unbelievers. So, oh gosh, I guess he's right, huh? I think as what they sometimes say in the physics community, and I forget the physicist who said this, it's not even wrong is the way to put it. For one thing, why does anything exist? Well, why does God exist? It's like the earth resting on the back of an elephant on top of a turtle, and what's underneath that? And oh, well, it's just turtles all the way down. You're always going to have an infinite regress. There's always going to be things you don't know, and you're always going to be able to say, well, then where did that come from? But of course, their faith will not allow them to question, where did God come from? Also, once you start saying, well, there was an intelligence that made the universe, then you might as well ask, well, how do we know it was only one? And how do we know it was a very intelligent kind of being? We've said before, maybe our universe is a fourth grade science experiment where a bunch of little Q children from the Star Trek Q continuum, these super powerful extraterrestrials, they were maybe given an assignment, create a universe and bring it to class, and you'll be graded on it. And I can't help but think that this particular universe would not get a very good grade if that were the case. But at any rate, you don't need God to explain the universe or why there's anything. The fine-tuning thing, I've always thought, is a very curious kind of explanation or thought to be a need to have a God, because after all, God can do anything. So it doesn't matter what the fine structure constant and all these other things are. God could have chosen them to be anything and still make everything work. Also, just because if the fine structure constant and some of these other variables, actual constants in physics, if they were varied, how do we know that you wouldn't still have life or something that would be able to think and so forth? Lots of ins and outs of that, but the fine-tuning experiment, fine-tuning argument is not even an argument if you really are talking about an omnipotent God. And then he says the best explanation for intelligent life, all life is intelligent. I mean, that's the whole idea, is life interacts with its environment. It's capable of learning, of seeking for food. And after all, that's what our intelligence is all about as well.
Tim, couldn't you replace the term God in his answers? I have placed 5 answers. Replace the word God with aliens.
Right. A super powerful extraterrestrial.
And there's no refuting that. He's got no refutation of that.
That's correct. And again, this goes to what I said earlier, is these are whores for the supernatural. They want to introduce this sort of thing, the supernatural. And really the supernatural is just a way of, it's just renaming our ignorance. Well, we don't have an explanation for this. It must be this. I mean, if God is just that, the so-called God of the gaps is just another word for our ignorance, then we're always going to have God, but there's no explanatory power in ignorance.
I kind of like the refutation of the first list item, that the universe needs a reason to exist, and then turning right around and saying, well, God is the reason the universe exists, and then turning right around and refuting the premise that God needs a reason to exist.
Right.
It's like you can't have it both ways.
And where did God come from? And if you don't like an infinite regress, which this guy has at other times objected to infinite regress, saying there's no and cannot be any actual infinities, but then he's going to let his God be an actual infinity.
Yeah, and you could just as easily say that and here's the retort that would come back to that. Well, there has to be one thing that doesn't have a reason, that that's at the beginning of it all. And then and then you simply come back and says, well, why can't that just be the universe itself? Why does it have to be something? Why does it have to be God, something that you attribute all these attributes to, when the universe will simply do much better?
That's a bizarre
Absolutely.
argument that he makes. You know, I don't typically respond to faith people with, you have no evidence. I typically respond to faith people with, doesn't make a damn. If there is a God or if there isn't a God, things are what they are. And there is no God that's interested in me personally, because that's just kind of stupid on its face. So I don't really care if you think there's a God or if there isn't a God. But if you think there's a big guy in the sky with a big chief tablet and a number 2 pencil keeping track of how many times I masturbate, I just have to disagree with you with that. You know, I just think that's just kind of stupid on its face. You might as well be talking about Thor and Odin and all the rest of the people on Olympia.
Well, and and that's kind of the straw man too. The straw man argument is saying, well, atheists say that you have no evidence. Well, no, that's the easy argument to defeat. No, the easier argument that you have is, let's look at the evidence that you have that God does exist and show how inconsistent and wrong it is. Let's look at these statements that you say, well, everything in the Bible is absolutely true, where you can go to specific chapters of the Bible and show that it is internally inconsistent.
Yeah. Yeah, so now you're getting into Christianity versus just the generic God business. If you get into Christianity and you look at what happened with COVID, I can't tell you the number of people that told me that they were relying on prayer instead of vaccine. I'd have to say their Jesus is broken.
Yeah, very good points. Of course, remember, Bill, that he also said that you can know God personally, through personal experience. And if you talk to if you talk to ex-Christians, they will often say that, yes, they thought they were talking to God in their minds, and then they later came to realize that they were just really talking to themselves. And this is really what it amounts to. You can personally know God, you just have to work harder at imagining it. And I think that's another criticism of unbelievers is the people who are believers they have imaginary friends like a typical 4-year-old. Not that there's anything terribly wrong with that, but shouldn't you really know that it's an imaginary friend? I mean, maybe it is better to have an imaginary friend than no friend at all, but the fact of the matter is that you cannot personally know some deity, some supernatural entity without just imagining it. He also refers to the historical facts about Jesus Christ, and of course, I think most of us are also familiar with multiple lines of evidence and argument that create really serious doubts that Jesus was actually a historical person, at least the Jesus as depicted in the Bible.
Yeah.
And lastly, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And there's lots of Jesuses. It was a common name. It's like being named Steve. There's lots of Jesuses, and some of them were rabble rousers, and probably some of them got crucified because they did that kind of thing.
Well, we know that there were mass crucifixions of the Romans, and I think Richard Carrier is the guy who probably has the best handle on how Christianity got started as Jesus being some kind of a celestial being who was posited to have walked the earth, but have done so incognito. Nobody knew who he was. And then later, of course, people filled it in and say, well, I had a vision and I know who he was, and here's the things he said when he was here, and so on and so forth, and it just grew from there. I think the other thing that's really an egregious kind of abuse here with Mr. Craig is talking about an objective moral value. And he frequently brings this up, saying that without God, you cannot have objective moral values. And I think it's an abuse of the term objective, because the term objective simply refers to things that are intersubjective. It means that two people can look at the moon and say, there's the moon. But no two people can look at something and say, well, here's objective morality. Not unless they both imagine the same deity and imagine that this deity spoke through the Bible, in which case, really, where in the Bible does it say that rape is wrong? Sometimes the God of the Bible says that despoiling people or killing them is perfectly okay. And God can just decide what's right or wrong on a moment-to-moment basis. What kind of morality is that? Not to mention the fact that a morality that becomes important and becomes subservient to the idea of getting into heaven and avoiding hell is no morality at all, because it just morality then becomes a means and not an end, and that's not acceptable for people like us. So go ahead.
I was going to say, how can you be objective if you're speaking from a believer point of view? What is it object? It's not objective. You have a side. If there are more than one sides of an issue, and you're talking from one side, then you're not objective.
If you have to have faith, then there's no objectivity about it, correct?
Yeah.
Nobody has faith when they look at the kinds of information that gets radioed back from the Mars rover and things like that. That's why it's objective, because it's observer independent. It doesn't matter who's doing the perceiving. But morality is one of those things. Not only that, but it confuses the idea of morality, how you should treat others versus how you should behave in your personal life. I think nobody really has explored that distinction very well, and certainly the Christians have totally fallen down on the job of that for thousands of years.
Elva had her hand up first.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that those people who say they have had an afterlife experience and they go toward the light and all that, that during brain surgery, they know what area of the brain to tickle or to touch with a probe to make that happen. And so it's all biology in my book. You know, may not all be explained yet, but it will be at some point.
Well, think of the arrogance. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say, we're certainly coming up at the point where probably the people involved in brain imaging are going to be able to see when people are imagining things. So you put somebody in a scanner and tell them to imagine talking to God, or imagine meeting with Batman or Benjamin Franklin sitting on the bench behind you. It's going to show the same kind of parts of the brain lighting up, I think.
Also, think about the extreme arrogance of making the statement that you can't be moral without God. You know, to say, well, you know, before Christianity was known around the world, the Chinese were not moral, and the natives in America and the Aztecs were not moral. None of those cultures had anyone who could be considered moral.
Yeah, good point.
It's frightening, actually, to think that Christians or anybody who takes this approach of God is necessary for morality, to think that if God didn't exist, and, you know, in other words, they can't even go there. If God didn't exist, that they could just go out and do all the terrible things they wanted. I think that most of us would agree with Gillette Penn that we already do all the robbing and killing and raping that we want, which is zero. And that's really the mark of a moral person, that you are not interested in doing those kinds of things. Now, it is a very interesting question and could be explored further, which is, if, besides all the biological and social reasons for behaving morally, why should you not cheat if you knew for sure that you could get away with it? That's an interesting question, but goes way beyond what we have time for today.
Let me interject something. You know, as far as the Bible just simply says, thou shalt not kill. Well, if we go with that completely, I am a killer. I just kill those bugs and roaches every time I see one of them.
Well, they didn't have permission to come in your house now, did they?
No, they didn't. I do it outside too.
And I think they were packing.
Anyone else?
I know you guys are going to think this is silly, but you know those big water bugs? I actually capture those and turn them loose outside. I don't kill them.
Yeah, are you a Buddhist, Bill? Do you follow Buddhist?
No, I just have empathy for all things. You know, I understand that there's a little bit of death involved in the life cycle, but I just don't like killing stuff. I don't like shooting birds or hunting.
My water bugs are so big that I just put a saddle on them and ride them around the apartment.
Yeah,
My son up in Plano, when he got a mouse in his house, well, he was actually living in Waxahachie at the time, but instead of setting a mouse trap, I mean, he captured it with a towel, throwing a towel over the mouse and turning it loose outside. But when I had a mouse in my kitchen not too long ago, I had no compunction about doing whatever it took to get that damn mouse out of my house. And I set traps and that didn't work. And I put the glue traps and my friend said, "Oh, that's so cruel. That's inhumane. Don't do that, Elva." I don't care. I'm going to get rid of that mouse. It didn't work. And I finally went to the feed store and put some poison and the mouse disappeared. I don't know where he went. He could be dead on the walls of my house. I don't know, but he went away.
Well, you know, Elva, when we say inhumane, that's only pertaining to humans anyway.
Greg,
well, I do think that sentient beings, I mean, that anything alive has a right to live. And I do feel bad sometimes when I step on an ant or squirt an anthill in my yard. You know, all these ants have come up with the rain. Now you have all these ant mounds in your yard.
So, and then incarcerated people we could consider immoral because they commit the crimes, and yet a very high percentage of incarcerated people are religious. The polls show they almost all believe in God.
Before or after they were incarcerated?
God believing because of their problems. Oh, there it is, lower hand.
Yeah, there's something wrong with your sound.
Audio.
Oh, okay.
I think the question of, or the subject of animal suffering is quite an interesting one too. Of course, Craig is completely not even acknowledging the huge number of arguments against the existence of at least the kind of God that they claim exists. It's one thing to say that, well, humans suffer because of the fall of Adam and so forth, but what purpose is served by animals suffering? That's, to me, seems like that's going to be a real problem for somebody who wants to believe in an all-powerful and all-good deity. Well, let's go on then.
I just want to say, I never ever let any animal suffer. I kill them fast.
Good for you. Got a little mouse guillotine in your house, do you, Nogan?
You know,
Hey.
I used to capture mouse and put them outside, and I got to reading about it, and they said, look, you're going to put them outside. They don't know where they are. They're going to be subject to predators. It's going to be a tough existence, and they're not going to survive. Be humane, get a snap trap.
That might be an interesting question.
Animals have been suffering for millions of years. Think of all the carnage that the dinosaurs, you see those big teeth on the Tyrannosaurus, you know their prey did not enjoy going down.
Well, and I mean, those tarantulas are going to come back in. Mice, they're going to come back in. So you're fighting a losing battle. Just kill them all.
I did stop to buy lunch at an Indian restaurant that just opened near my house yesterday. I went in there and it had a big sign that they have halal. It just said halal, right, on the front of the restaurant. And that's a Muslim term, right? Halal meat. And they have
it's like kosher.
It's like ritual killing. Yeah, it has to be humane, blah, 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 blah.
Have you seen Mecca?
Okay, the major thing about halal is they drain the blood of the animal. And it's a scientific reason for that. Because once
kosher does that too, like Tim said.
Well, the reason is when you, Tim would know that for sure. When you hit an animal and injured, the body
Plus
produces,
the stress, it releases cortisol or stress
right,
hormone.
stress hormone, which is harmful to
Yeah.
human body. So
Yeah.
immediately they drain the blood so it does not taint the meat.
So like,
So I wonder how most Christians would answer the question if you posed it to them and asked them, is it immoral to torture an animal? And you could give like 3 examples and see how they respond to each. You know, okay, is it immoral to torture a dog? Well, they'll probably answer yes, because hey, dogs are pets. And then, is it immoral to torture a cow or a chimpanzee? And not just, you know, yes or no, but why?
yeah.
Yeah.
So
May
is it
I say
okay?
something?
Is it okay to torture a chimpanzee to develop vaccines or, you know, or
No, I'm not even
medication?
talking a useful purpose. I'm talking about just torture, just for the
Oh my
sake of it.
gosh.
Let me ask you something. I had just watched this wonderful documentary, which I would advise all of you to watch, from Netflix, and it's called Seaspiracy. Okay, here's a question that I would like to pose. You know, we have this thing with Save the Whales, and how awful it is, you know, when they're killing a whale, and the pain and so forth that this animal is suffering. And then they'll say, you know, you shouldn't do this or whatever with the animal. But then they overlook the pain of a chicken. It seems like killing thousands of chickens, that's not a problem. But they assume, I suppose, there's certain animals that don't experience death and pain the same way as some other animal. So really, why aren't we protecting chickens? What is the reason for protection for a whale and not protection for a chicken?
Well, these are really fascinating questions, and I would draw our attention and people who might be watching the YouTube version of this later. Look at how the traditional mainline churches have completely fallen down on the job of considering these kinds of things. I mean, would you really want someone to babysit your kids who in their spare time is torturing dogs? But it doesn't say in the Bible or anywhere that it's wrong to torture dogs. And yet I think that we could easily see that that is not a moral activity, even though it doesn't hurt another person. Torturing a dog just for the fun of it, that's wrong. So let's watch the rest of this. He's going to flesh out one of the arguments you'll see coming up here. It's just really comical to see him giving this advice to Christians who are going to get way over their head just only if they just memorize his list. And remember we said, we don't want you memorizing anything. We want you thinking it through, and anybody watching this video will see there's lots of thought that goes into our opinions.
He doesn't even ask to hear the arguments. Just hearing a list of them is often enough. So I would encourage all of us to have such a list memorized that you can just share at the drop of a hat with an unbeliever. Now, if he does want to press you, each one of those points in the list has an argument that has premises or steps that you can memorize and again then share with him. For example, the argument that God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe is very easy to memorize. It has just 3 steps. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And that will show that we don't live in an isolated system, that there is a transcendent cause beyond space and time, beyond the universe, that has brought the universe into being, which has obvious theological implications. So if you have these premises memorized, then you are prepared to actually share the argument with the unbeliever. But in many cases, you won't even need to do that if you just have a list. I would encourage every Christian to have a list of arguments memorized that he can share with an unbeliever. The typical unbeliever, in my experience, has no good reason for his unbelief. He's simply been taught.
Well, who wants to take that apart? Anything that begins to exist had a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, God made the universe.
By the way, we just got the video, and you turned it off.
Oh,
Now, well, I've heard this first cause argument a number of times, and the big leap is the one at the end. It says, well, the big leap is, okay, if there was a cause, well, why does it have to be a deity, specifically your deity? That's the part you just made up.
well, I would also just argue from analogy too. Here's a snowflake. Did the snowflake begin to exist? Yes. It had a beginning, so it had to have a cause. Does that mean that God personally made every snowflake? I mean, some believers may claim that, but I think we have plenty of other explanations for where the snowflake came from. For one thing, it came from pre-existing materials, which is to say water molecules that condensed out of the air and crystallized.
Yeah, it's a classic God of the gaps argument.
Right. Are you saying you didn't see the last part of the video?
No, it's just that you started, it looked like you started replaying the video that
Yes.
went with the audio that you started out with.
Right. Yes, I was just trying to close it out. And in a minute, we'll have another video, but let me put this back up again.
Tim, why are we not seeing the picture? All I see is a phone when you play the video. Oh, okay.
He's getting better at it.
It's kind of hard to toggle back and forth and so on. So anyways, anybody else want to deconstruct that? You have to memorize these lists now in order to deal with the believers, right? No, I would never advise somebody to believe and try to promote something just on memorizing a list. If you're going to really explain something to somebody, you have to understand it. And I think we all recognize that.
Yeah, the moment you go off script, things go down.
Do you have that list, Tim? I'd like to see that list, really, if you can put it in chat.
Oh yeah, we'll have to provide a list of how to proselytize for atheism.
No, I'm
All
talking
right.
about the list of this guy is giving his believers the list that to discuss against the two non-believers. I'm talking about that list.
I don't have that written form to provide on the chat, but if you go to YouTube, you can watch that video as many times as you wish.
Okay.
Like I said, there's
Would you
lots of his on YouTube, and you'll see he pulls out the same thing time after time. If you want to see him really taken apart pretty well, Sean Carroll, physicist, does a good job of taking them apart. And there's a philosopher, I think his name is Shelley Kagan, Kagan, so takes William Lane Craig apart pretty well. But you see what his manner is. I mean, he's very authoritative, and just that very thing alone goes a long ways with anybody who's really kind of thoughtful about things. It's kind of like Bertrand Russell once said that those who understand things are kind of uncertain and hesitant, but the people who do weirdo things, the wrong things, they're cocksure, and they just plow through whatever their opposition is.
Could you put the URL of this video to chat?
Well,
Please?
I don't have it up, but maybe John can look it up while I'm showing you a few other things. We have a brief moment of science. I just came across this other thing off of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a wonderful organization, by the way, the AAAS. I've been a member for years and years. They publish Science magazine. It's probably the United States premier science magazine. The one in the UK is Nature magazine. But for your enjoyment, here is a moment of science. Let me just get to the video and get it up there. Well, this may take me a couple minutes to find where the video is.
And the Sean Carroll video, can you give me some more detail while I search for it?
Well, of course, Sean is spelled S-E-A-N.
No, I've got the name. It's
William Lane Craig, and if you put those two names in there, I think you'll be able to find it.
Okay, got it.
and you can put that in the chat.
And this pastor, what was his name again?
William Lane Craig, and he is
Okay.
he's not a pastor anywhere. He's some professor of theology, I think at Biola University or some kind of Christian place. This is the other thing, of course, some of these colleges that require a statement of faith. I mean, how much can you really trust these people when they have to, they agree ahead of time to be intellectually dishonest by sticking to a statement of faith? I have very little respect for that sort of thing.
I don't think that's dishonest or anything. I think they're just one, they have those horse classes, that's it. I'm pretty sure they wholeheartedly believe what they believe.
That may be for them to have to, then they shouldn't have to make a statement of faith. I mean, if their faith is so strong and so forth, but they're not allowed to even question
They think faith is a legitimate reason. They don't think faith is just choosing dogma. They don't think faith as a dogma. They think that's a legitimate reason, and you have to have faith for whatever you do. And believe, not believe, you have, even if you do not believe, non-believer, you have to have faith to not believe. It's so stupid argument. The first non-believer denies is faith, which is a dogma. No matter what the reason, no matter what logic is there, you still have to believe. That means it's a dogma. So they go with that. It's very difficult to get over it. You have to upfront accept their right, period. And they have faith, and faith is the only thing. If you don't, you have to have more stronger faith not to believe than to believe.
That's correct.
But I think when you go to university, the purpose of a university education is to learn. And so when you have to commit to, I believe this and this and this, like Liberty University or those kinds of.
Not in Baptist University, you don't.
Yeah.
Not in Baptist University, you don't have to have that kind of understanding of dogma and reason and logic. You don't need any of that. Like Dallas Baptist University, they tell you to have faith. End of story.
Right.
That's not a research university. That's exchanging white paper, green paper with a white paper university.
It's to control their students' mindset. You know, they can't let their children or their students go to a public university where they might be exposed to different philosophies.
I guess you have been reading in the paper how we are trying to change what you can or cannot teach in your school systems. And so there's this big argument now, which, you know, it'd be like you don't dare say anything about actual history that might go against the history of what we've done in our country. And I find this to be really a dumbing down of our public school system if this is what is going to be required.
As far as racism and stuff like that.
Oh, everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, big fight in Plano.
Yeah.
I've seen this before. I've seen it with the Texas School Board trying to limit science.
Do you know
Matter of fact, one of my favorite nonprofits is Texas Freedom Network. That's what they exist for, is to oppose that kind of thing.
I don't know if any of you watched the Netflix documentary by Leah Remini, and I had watched one a couple of years ago, but there's a new one out called Scientology and Its Aftermath. And it is really frightening to see how Scientology has taken over the city of Clearwater, Florida. They have infiltrated the police department, which doesn't respond to anything that, you know, is not, that has to do with Scientology, following and threatening and blah, blah, blah. So they've infiltrated the city council. They've gotten their people elected at Clearwater, Florida. They've infiltrated the police department. They've bought up all of these buildings downtown. And it was eye-opening for me. So I do.
I read her book too. Did you read her book? I watched the documentary. Her book is just more detailed.
I read her book. She reads it herself if you get the Audible version.
I'm sorry. Oh, I don't know. I read her book about 3-4 years ago when it first came out.
Yeah, but I think this is new information even. This is newer. Because I watched the documentary a couple of 3 years ago, but this is new information.
I'll follow up on Netflix.
Yeah.
Well, it's like I made a policy of my own that anybody wants money from me is out. Anybody says, hey, you need to take this course and buy this book, I'm saying, screw you. Give it to me for free, then I'll think about it.
You know,
Okay, here's your moment of science now. Sorry it took a while. We forget sometimes that food is a science. There are food scientists and food science. And I came across this and I thought it was quite interesting, certainly worth thinking about. If I can only get here's
like
the
a
volume.
party favor, but the method used to shape it has a more practical future.
Let me back up.
Check out the moves on this strip of polymer. It may look like a party favor, but the method used to shape it has a more practical future. Researchers have found a way to program flat strips of pasta to morph into familiar 3D varieties. 3D pastas need extra packaging to fit their distinct shapes, making them harder to transport and leading to waste. Transforming pasta from flat to 3D could solve those problems. The researchers began by flattening dough made of semolina flour, an ingredient of traditional Italian pasta. Then they honed them into strips scored with grooves. Adjusting the grooves' depth and spacing changed the strip's shape as they swelled and settled in boiling water. Different designs turned into saddles, curls, and bow ties. The researchers fed the test data into computer models that could replicate the process. They believed machine learning could automate the technique, making it easier for food companies to design and deliver 3D pastas. The next step is testing other morphable foods, such as the gelatin found in wagashi, a popular type of Japanese dessert. Imagine the tasty possibilities.
What do you think of that?
I have only 3 words for you. Money, money, money.
Well, yes, of course, that's the whole idea. Make two ears of corn grow where one used to be. I mean, did you catch that thing? They can make the flat pasta, but they pattern it or emboss it in such a way that when you cook it, then it becomes the bow ties and the strings and, whatever shape that you want it to be. Of course, you could also not just say, what about money, money, money? I'd say that it's a commercial motivation. Yes, it is. But it's also, we want our pasta to have a particular shape. Isn't that kind of crazy? If
that shape loses me money, I don't want it. That's
right.
The whole. What's the purpose of having a company, a business making money? If putting it pasta in a certain shape increases the waste, and I cannot, and decreases my profit, I will not produce and I will not sell that item.
But the point is that it's going to be less waste when all the pasta can be packaged flat and takes up less space, and then you have less plastic bags to pollute the ocean and so on and so forth. So this is actually
still the money. It's still the money. It's a very good way of packaging and shipping. It's you ship more with less space.
Well, isn't that a good thing?
I don't have a problem with that.
That's a good thing.
It's a good
Yeah, it's
thing.
not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that part of the business, that part of the food business, but the major principle of a business is making money, period.
Well, it's producing goods and services that people will pay for. And the nice thing about it is that you don't have to buy pasta if you don't want to. I don't eat pasta. It's too much calories. I'd be back up to near 300 pounds like I used to be. So, but anyways, that's a moment of science, and I hope that it was stimulating, give you something to think about. You know, similar ideas have been like, if you could grow square tomatoes, they would take up less shipping space. That's also been toyed with. So just shows there's a lot of science even in what we eat and drink. And here's just a reminder that, you know, we do what other churches do without the supernatural, but we also do what none of the other churches do, have the kind of discussions that we're having now today. And we insist that people want to be connected with us should question, should doubt, learn, grow, and seek understanding. That's way up there. Belief is not all it's cracked up to be. Belief actually gets people in a lot of trouble. You really don't need to believe that much. Concern yourself with what matters and not what does not matter. I mean, I'm interested in pasta, but now I'm going to have to watch and see if they can make pasta out of something that's less full of calories, for me at least. Always pursue the good for the love of the good, and not because of fear of punishment or hope of reward. The fact that our lives are temporary does not ruin them in any way. The fact that our lives and the things that we do not have cosmic significance does not rob them of all significance. That's why it's important for us to make the most of life. Boils down even more, our principles, which amazingly enough spell R-E-A-L, real, appreciation and love. Two things about 16th, and mute yourself if you're coughing or something like that, of course. 1771, who's ever heard of the Battle of Alamance? It's a place in North Carolina, and this was a skirmish that took place between the authorities and some colonists, and may have been the forerunner to the American Revolutionary War. They were protesting taxes and other policies of the crown that were being imposed upon them. 4 years before Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. A bunch of people were hurt and killed. 6 people were arrested and hung as traitors. There were some others that were arrested also as traitors, but were pardoned by the governor. And on this date in 1866, the U.S. Congress enacted the nickel. Our nickels that have Thomas Jefferson on them. That's when they were authorized. In 1918, the Sedition Act. Many of us, you might not be aware of it, but this was actually a federal law which criminalized any criticism of the government in wartime. It was repealed a couple of years later. You think we got problems these days with scary things being imposed upon us. In 1960, on this date, the first optical laser was operated at the Hughes Research Foundation. It was a ruby laser, the little red dot. I'm not sure if it was a helium neon or what, but it was called a ruby laser. And in 1969, Venera 5, which was the Soviet Union's spaceship's descent to Venus, this was the first landing on another planet, in this case Venus. And you can see there the same year that we landed people on the moon, but it turns out that the Soviet Union continued to use landers. They were actually the first to have a soft landing on Mars. So they beat us in all kinds of things, but the dramatic first human being walking on the moon, obviously the U.S. is understood to have won the space race, so-called. And as we move on to even more discussion about various things, including whether we're going to continue to do these weekly or have some in-person meetings, at least some of the time, remember that politics is kind of a tripwire and can sometimes create problems with civility. And we have to remember, of course, that incivility hurts all of us, and especially those who engage in it. So let's not be a victim of incivility, either by committing it or allowing it to bother us when it happens, when we see it coming from other people, not only here today, but in our lives generally. And remember too, we have a great emphasis on our minds, reason, facts, and so forth, but we're also bodies. And our bodies react to what's going on in our minds and vice versa. So that we should be aware of our own and others' body language, our voice, intonation, posture, and behaviors. I don't have a good solution to what happens, what you should do when people say something to you and it upsets you, because you can't always control how your body feels, but being aware of it is the first step towards getting control of it. Freethought is not free. Remember to visit and donate at www.churchoffreethought.org. And we mentioned earlier that that bulletin is there, which talks about that book, that it takes more faith to be an atheist, supposedly. We very much depend on your continued support. Visit us on Facebook and Twitter. There are the links which you can either copy down, or maybe we'll put those in the comment section when John posts it later on. But as I said, we very much depend on your support. And if you believe in your values, if they're important to you, then promote your values. And you can do that by supporting the NTCOF. Do together what none of us can do on our own. And we still have that special discount sale using code ThinkNow, and you only have to tithe 8% instead of the full 10%. Yeah, if you're laughing, that's a good, that's why. Join with us, though, in promoting facts and reason, and join us in celebrating doubt. You don't have to have an answer for everything. We don't say have an answer for everything. You know, sometimes the best answer is to say, I don't know. There's nothing wrong with not knowing. And the fact of the matter is, the truth is, on a lot of things, we just don't know. And better to know nothing than to believe what is false, as Thomas Jefferson and many others have observed over the ages. Demonstrate your commitment by being the future that you wish to see. So thank you very much and good morning. And with that, we'll move on to Q&A discussion, and we'll begin with how we should go forward in terms of our Zoom meetings versus in-person meetings. So check back. And if you're still watching on YouTube, go and sign up on our website to get our newsletters, and that way you'll find out what we're doing and be reminded of our get-togethers either online or in person. Thank you again.